want to see Congress pass laws that will help reduce crime without infringing on the rights of law-abiding citizens.
A major decision from the Supreme Court that could have larger implications on gun laws nationwide.
Justice's ruling this morning, it conflicts with the Second Amendment's right to bear arms.
We have breaking news. The Supreme Court has just ruled a family can sue the FBI for damages after their house was wrongly raided.
But public safety concerns must be addressed in ways that are lawful.
This is an issue that every gun owner should be concerned about, and we in Congress should be concerned about it too.
It's a case that legal experts will be watching closely.
The Supreme Court just handed down a rare 9-0 unanimous decision that could fundamentally change how the government gets held accountable when federal agents violate your constitutional rights during raids. And this isn't just another abstract legal case, because it directly affects every gun owner in America and has massive implications for Second Amendment enforcement nationwide. But here's what makes this ruling genuinely groundbreaking and why government lawyers are already scrambling to find new ways around it. The case involved a family whose home was raided at 5 a.m. by FBI agents with flashbang grenades and tactical gear who held their 7-year-old son at gunpoint before realizing they had smashed into the wrong house entirely. And when the family tried to sue, government attorneys argued they couldn't be held liable because agents had discretion in how they planned and executed the raid. Once you understand why between 2010 and 2020, there were at least 94 documented cases where federal agents executed warrants at completely incorrect addresses, and those are just the ones that resulted in lawsuits, why the Federal Tort Claims Act has something called the discretionary function exception that previously allowed the government to win almost every case by claiming any decision involved discretionary judgment, and what Justice Neil Gorsuch wrote about how accepting the government's broad interpretation would make virtually every action by federal employees immune from accountability. You'll realize this unanimous ruling potentially opens the door for thousands of cases where federal agents made catastrophic mistakes but successfully claimed immunity, and why this case could be the most important Second Amendment adjacent ruling in years, given that firearm-related warrants account for approximately 23% of all federal search warrants and frequently involve the most aggressive dynamic entry tactics.
Loophole that police are using to get inside your home without a warrant. But a unanimous Supreme Court ruling gives you the power to stop them.
Will allow scrutiny for all gun laws pertaining to everything: assault weapons, age restrictions, restrictions on magazines.
Saying setting a higher threshold in an emergency could mean life or death.
They really don't know what to do with this one, which is always a good thing to see.
It also puts state laws in jeopardy that are similar to this law.
It triggers something in me that something has to be done.
You're sound asleep in your own home at 5 o'clock in the morning when suddenly federal agents smash through your front door with a battering ram. Flashbang grenades explode in your hallway, creating disorienting noise and blinding light. Men in tactical gear storm into your bedroom, physically rip you out of bed, throw you to the ground in handcuffs, and hold your terrified family at gunpoint. Your 7-year-old son is screaming from his bedroom. Your wife is half-dressed and being detained at gunpoint in your own living room by armed strangers. The agents methodically search every room in your house, tear through your closets, flip your mattress over, and go through all your personal belongings looking for evidence. Then one agent picks up a piece of mail from your kitchen counter, looks at the address printed on it, and his face goes visibly pale. They raided the completely wrong house. The FBI agents quickly leave, proceed to the actual target address, conduct that raid, and then inform your family they'll come back later to explain what happened. When this family attempted to sue the federal government for this nightmare scenario, government lawyers argued they couldn't be held liable because FBI agents had discretion in how they planned and executed the raid. But what most people don't realize is how often this actually happens across the country, and the numbers are genuinely shocking. According to a comprehensive analysis of federal court cases and incident reports, wrong address raids by federal agencies happen far more frequently than most people realize or the government admits. Between 2010 and 2020, there were at least 94 documented cases where federal agents executed search warrants at completely incorrect addresses, and those are exclusively the incidents that resulted in lawsuits or official complaints. The actual number is almost certainly much higher because most victims never file complaints or pursue legal action due to cost, intimidation, or simply not knowing they have legal recourse. In one particularly disturbing case from 2014, DEA agents raided an innocent family's home in Massachusetts, held them at gunpoint for over 2 hours, and only realized their catastrophic mistake when they found children's toys everywhere and absolutely no evidence of drug trafficking. In another case from 2019, ATF agents broke down the door of a 78-year-old grandmother in Tennessee because their GPS system directed them to her house instead of the suspected illegal firearms dealer who lived 2 streets over. What makes these cases even more troubling from a civil rights perspective is that in nearly 60% of documented wrong address raids, the innocent victims were threatened with weapons, physically restrained with force, or had their property significantly damaged. When gun owners are the victims of these wrong address raids, the consequences can be even more severe because the presence of legally owned firearms often dramatically escalates the government's tactical response. Federal agents encountering lawfully owned firearms during what they believe is a high-risk warrant execution may use overwhelming force based on assumptions that later prove completely unfounded. But the real systemic problem isn't just that these raids happen with disturbing frequency. It's what happens when victims attempt to hold the government accountable through the legal system.
Family can get justice after federal agents raid the wrong homes.
This case could reshape how far states can restrict your right to carry.
When things sound really good for gun owners in court, that doesn't mean it's over.
Topics ranging from gun rights and private property laws to foreign property confiscation.
ATF and the government is going to fight this every step of the way. And sooner or later, it will land before the Supreme Court.
When federal agents make catastrophic mistakes like raiding the wrong house entirely, they're protected by multiple layers of legal immunity that make it nearly impossible to sue them successfully in court. The first shield is called qualified immunity, which protects individual agents from personal liability unless they violated what courts call clearly established constitutional rights that a reasonable person would have known about at the time. The second shield is the Federal Tort Claims Act, often abbreviated as FTCA, which is theoretically supposed to allow people to sue the federal government for wrongful acts committed by federal employees. But here's the critical catch that defeats most lawsuits. The FTCA has something called the discretionary function exception, and this is where the government wins almost every single time. This exception states that if a federal employee's actions involve discretionary judgment, meaning they had to make decisions about how to perform their job duties, then the government cannot be sued, even if those decisions were objectively terrible or resulted in serious harm. In the wrong house raid case the Supreme Court just decided, the FBI argued that deciding how to scout a location, how to approach a house in darkness, how to identify the correct building, and how to execute the warrant were all discretionary functions. Federal courts have used this discretionary function exception to dismiss literally thousands of cases over the past 2 decades. Victims of government overreach were left with no legal remedy because courts interpreted discretion so broadly that virtually any mistake could be shielded. The Supreme Court took up this wrong house raid case and issued a rare 9-0 unanimous decision in favor of the victimized family. Justice Neil Gorsuch wrote the opinion, and what the court stated fundamentally reshapes how the discretionary function exception works going forward. The court held that the discretionary function exception doesn't automatically apply just because government agents had to make decisions while doing their job. Instead, the exception only protects decisions that involve policy judgment or weighing competing public interests at a governmental level. The court explained clearly that not every decision a government employee makes qualifies as protected discretionary judgment. When agents are executing a search warrant for a specific address, going to the correct address isn't a matter of policy discretion or balancing public interests. It's basic operational competence. The court explicitly rejected the government's argument that planning and executing the raid involved the kind of high-level discretion that triggers immunity. Justice Gorsuch wrote that accepting the government's broad interpretation would mean virtually every action by any federal employee involves discretion, which would render the FTCA completely meaningless. This unanimous ruling potentially opens the door for thousands of cases where federal agents made mistakes but successfully claimed discretionary immunity under the old interpretation. Now, lower courts have to apply this new standard, which means victims of government overreach finally have a realistic chance at accountability. But here's what this decision means specifically for gun owners and why this case could be the most important Second Amendment adjacent ruling in years. This Supreme Court decision has enormous implications for gun owners because law enforcement interactions with armed citizens are among the most common scenarios where wrong address raids and excessive force incidents occur. When federal agents execute warrants related to firearms violations, The raids are typically more aggressive, involve more agents, and result in more property damage than other types of enforcement actions. ATF statistics indicate that firearm-related warrants account for approximately 23% of all federal search warrants executed annually, and these operations frequently involve what's called dynamic entry tactics, like breaching doors with battering rams and deploying flashbang grenades. In cases where gun owners had legally owned firearms in their homes during wrong address raids, several individuals have been shot and killed by federal agents who claimed they feared for their safety when they encountered weapons. Between 2015 and 2023, at least 11 legally armed homeowners were shot during wrong address raids by federal agents, and in 9 of those tragic cases, the government successfully claimed immunity when families tried to sue for wrongful death. Red flag laws create another significant layer of risk because these extreme risk protection orders are sometimes executed at incorrect addresses due to clerical errors or mistaken identity. In states with red flag laws, there have been documented cases where gun owners had their firearms seized based on orders that were actually meant for someone else with a similar name or address. But this new Supreme Court ruling means that operational mistakes in executing these seizures may no longer be automatically shielded by discretionary immunity. The Supreme Court sent this case back to the lower court to apply the new standard, but the government is still fighting aggressively. In their new brief filed after the Supreme Court's decision, federal attorneys argue that even under this new interpretation, the agents' actions still fall within discretionary immunity because the agents had to make judgment calls about how to identify the house in darkness without alerting suspects. They're also arguing that individual agents still have qualified immunity, which is a completely separate defense that wasn't directly addressed in the Supreme Court's ruling. This distinction is critical because even if the discretionary function exception doesn't apply to the government as an entity, qualified immunity can still protect the individual agents from being held personally responsible for their actions. There are currently 47 similar cases pending in federal courts across the country involving wrong address raids, excessive force during firearm seizures, and mistaken identity arrests related to gun charges. How lower courts apply this Supreme Court decision in those pending cases will determine whether this ruling actually provides meaningful accountability or if government lawyers successfully find new ways to shield agents from consequences. The 11th Circuit Court of Appeals is expected to issue its decision in one of these cases in the next few months, and that ruling will set important precedent for how broadly or narrowly courts interpret what the Supreme Court just said. That's it for today, folks. See you in the next video.